Okay, so good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's event and a very happy International Women's Day to you all. I'm Rachel Selfridge. I'm Head of Engagement at the University of Leicester here in the Development and Alumni Relations team, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome you all this evening. I'm so pleased that so many of our alumni are able to join us this evening, as well as other friends and guests too. And no matter where you are in the world, we'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you as you join us for our first Festival of Change event of this year, My Flying Career. Not mine, unfortunately. I hope you're looking forward to hearing from your fellow alumni, Sandya, as much as I am. Just a few housekeeping items before we start this evening. So please do keep your videos on for the duration of today's event so that we can all see each other. But do keep your microphones muted so that we can all hear Sandya and all the terribly interesting things that I'm sure she's got to share with us this evening. I'm sure many of you are now very used to participating in online events, but as a reminder, you can find the microphone and camera button at the bottom of your screen. Please do post your questions in the chat box. We'll answer as many as we can during the Q&A section later on in the event. And just a little plea from me to say, please do stay in the loop with alumni news and events. Please make sure that your contact details are up to date. And if you are a user of social media, then you can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram and LinkedIn at Leicester Alumni. If you're interested in becoming more involved, then do let us know in the event evaluation form, which will be posted here in the chat at the end of today's event. We really value all feedback that we receive. It helps us to shape future events and make sure that we continue to improve those events and better support our alumni community. Thank you again for joining us this evening, and I really hope that you do enjoy yourselves. But without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce and hand over to Sandya Narayanswami.
First of all, I would like to thank the University of Leicester Office of Development and Alumni Relations for inviting me to do this at all. It would have been an honor in any situation, but the fact that it's International Women's Day makes it very, very special. So I hope that you enjoy what I have to say, and I will get started on talking about my flying career, which came to me rather suddenly. So I'll start with a bit of personal background. I'm a University of Leicester graduate, and I graduated from the School of Biological Sciences in 1976, a long time ago, when the university was very much smaller than it is today. And I got a first-class honours. And I had a wonderful time at Leicester. The culmination of my activities, quite apart from any sort of academic distinction, was that I was on the University Challenge team in 1975 and 6, and I was actually the first woman on the show. And that I consider just a wonderful experience. It was very, very special. I went on to do a PhD in biology, 2 postdocs, one in France, and then I moved to the US, where I had a faculty position at the Jackson Laboratory. So I was for about 25 years doing research in molecular biology, specifically chromosome structure. But at a certain point, I switched careers. And after a lot of thinking, I switched into fundraising, because I noticed that American universities were hiring a lot of fundraisers, but that having a science background makes you rather unique. I'd already done a lot of grant writing and got a lot of grant funding. And so I specialized in foundation relations, where you manage the foundation fundraising program for an institution. I had jobs at several universities, and most recently ended up at Caltech, where I was director of corporate and foundation relations, and then foundation relations from 2006 to 2014. So I managed the whole of Caltech's foundation fundraising. So really grants are my specialty. In 2014, I decided to launch my own business. So that's a separate story, but I got into flying when I was at Caltech. So I'd been there for several years. I had a lot of friends at Caltech and JPL, the Jet Propulsion Lab, and I went over for Christmas to see one of them. And, I'm over there and we're surrounded by, aerospace engineers from the Jet Propulsion Lab. And I asked these guys, oh, what do you do for fun? They go, we fly planes. And I thought, oh, wow, well, of course they do. They're aerospace engineers. Of course they fly planes. But it made me somewhat yearn towards doing that. And my girlfriend said to me, well, if you're interested, join the club. I said, what club? She goes, the flying club. I said, what flying club? She goes, the Caltech flying club. Caltech has a flying club? That was the first I'd ever heard about it. But the very next day, I emailed the flying club and I had a cup of coffee with the president. And I found out a little bit more about the Caltech Flying Club, which is in fact the oldest flying club in the Los Angeles basin. It's over 50 years old. It was launched by Caltech undergraduates with one plane in their fleet. They bought it themselves. And it was a spin-off of the fact that Caltech has always been very prominent in aviation. What most people don't realize is it spun off the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and unlike all the other NASA labs, it still manages JPL. Another thing people don't know necessarily is that every single plane designed in the United States until the end of World War II was tested in the Caltech wind tunnel. So Caltech has an enormous investment in both aviation and aerospace and space exploration. The club itself has a lot of Caltech students, and it's one way for people who are interested in this to get into the space program. So the club has graduated 3 astronauts, most recently Garrett Reisman. And there are a lot of young people who want to go into the astronaut program. They start out by coming to Caltech, they get a pilot's license, and they go into it that way. So it's always had that piece to it. But about 50% of the members are non-Caltech JPL. It's got a very large number of members from the local community. And it now has 9 planes at a small local airport, El Monte Airport, which is, about a 40-minute drive east of Caltech. And it's just a really amazing club. So I was having coffee with the president, and I said to him, well, I'm kind of old. Can you learn to fly at my age? Because I was already 57, in my mid-50s at that time. And he said, as long as your health is good, you can learn to fly. We train pilots in their 80s. So I thought, well, I'm going to do this. Because in my life, what I've found is that some things only come your way once in a lifetime. I really had always wanted to fly. In fact, when I was younger, I wanted to be an astronaut. So I never got to be that. But to me, flying a plane is the closest I've been able to get to going into space, And I thought, well, I may never get this chance again. So I just decided to go with it. And I joined the flying club, and I decided I would take on flight training. We have an aviation thread in my family, so it's not really that abnormal. My mother worked at BOAC at Heathrow Airport her whole life, and then until it became British Airways, and then she was at British Airways. And my dad put in the infrastructure for shipping air cargo to India from the UK. So before he got involved, all air cargo, there was no air cargo, it all went to sea to India. So he put in all the infrastructure. So they were in ground ops. So for me, it was kind of interesting to think about learning to fly a plane. It took a little while to get off the ground, to use an aviation metaphor, because at that time I had a green card. So I had to go through a lot of federal background checks as a result of 9/11. And that took about 3 months, at which time I did not fly, but I was doing background reading. And then I started flying lessons. So our club actually trains people. When I first joined the flying club, I thought, oh, this is just a place where you can rent a plane if you already have a pilot's license. But in fact, they train pilots. All the principals in the club are certificated flight instructors. So they are qualified by the FAA to teach students to fly. The first thing you start with really is a training flight. You go up for an hour. Typical lesson is an hour. You learn to manage the plane. You have an instructor sitting in the right seat. So for those who don't know, training planes like Cessna 172s, they have 2 seats in the front, a left seat and a right seat. and the plane is controllable from both sides. So you can access the controls from either side. So you, the student who knows nothing, flies the plane, and the instructor sits in the right seat, keeps an eye on you. And the first thing my instructor said to me was, it doesn't matter if you do anything really stupid, I can get the plane out of it. This is supposed to be fun. So, you know, this is what we'll do. And he explains the process. And it's quite complicated. You go to the airport, you have to do what's called a pre-flight, which is a check that all is well with the flight systems, the fuselage, the outside of the plane, all the instrumentation. You have a checklist. You learn very quickly that everything in aviation requires a checklist because it's very complicated. And if you make a mistake, it can be very, very dangerous. So everything is done with a checklist. You have a pre-flight checklist. You get in the plane. Well, you have to tow the plane out of its parking space. So you have a tow bar. The plane typically weighs about 2,000 pounds. So it's a good workout. You get in the plane. You have a checklist to start everything. You learn to communicate with air traffic control. Our airport, El Monte, is towered. So one of the pieces of learning that you have is to talk to tower. You start the plane. It's terrifying the first time you do this and the propeller starts, but you get used to it. You taxi the plane to what's called the run-up area. It took me forever to learn to taxi. It feels very different from driving a car because you've got wings on each side and you can feel the wind. The brakes are different from a car. The controls are a little different. It took me a long time to learn to taxi the plane in a straight line, for instance. It's not a skill set that came naturally to me. You go to the run-up area, which is an area set aside by the top of the runway where you check the engine. So you check all the engine functions, you make sure everything's working, and then you set up and then you taxi to the hold short point, which is the top of the runway. And then you have to learn to talk to the tower and wait for clearance to take off. You don't do anything without clearance. And one of the things about communication is it's a closed circle. It's a complete circle. You talk to tower, tower gives you an order, you repeat it back to them. So they know that you know, and both sides know that both sides understood the command. So this is something where I think a lot of times, even in real life, people can close a communication loop and they don't. So, but you have to do that in aviation. Then you take off. It's amazing the first time you do that. With my early lessons, we went to what's called the training area, closest to Caltech and the airport, and we did maneuvers. You learn to control the plane, you learn to hold altitude, you learn to fly in a straight line, you know, the basics. You learn to talk to people in the air, make sure other pilots can see you and you can see them, watch for traffic. All the basics of keeping a plane in the air. And then, of course, the hardest part is landing. When I was early in my training, somebody said to me, well, you know, takeoff is easy, the plane flies itself, landing is hard. And this is true. Training planes are made to be aerodynamic. They want to fly. They don't want to land. So you basically bring the plane down and you force it into a stall 5 feet above the runway. That is how you actually land a plane. It took me a long time to learn to land a plane. It's actually quite complicated. It took me forever. The next step is first solo, but I was not really allowed to do a solo until I could land well, because you're up there on your own. In this way, flying is different from driving. I don't know about England, but in the United States, you take driving lessons, or you learn to drive. You get a driver's license, and then you can just drive on your own. But until you get a license, you can't drive a car on your own. With flying, there's a period in your training where you have to learn to solo, that is, fly without an instructor, even though you are not licensed, because it's too complicated a skill set to be left until you're licensed. And nobody does a first solo until they feel comfortable that they're at that point. It took me a long time to get to that point because I'm older. It's not really my primary skill set. You know, I'm a person who I draw, paint, I cook, I entertain, I garden, I like to sew. I'm not very athletic. So flying a plane was really a challenge for me. And it took me the longest part of my training to get to first solo. This is different for everybody. You know, some people get there very, very quickly, especially when you're younger. But I got there and I decided I was ready for my first solo. And my instructor said, well, the week before your solo, we will have you go up with another instructor to make sure you're ready. So I had what's called a pre-solo phase check. So I went up with a different instructor. He put me through all the various parts of doing the solo, taking off, maneuvering around the runway, talking to tower, landing the plane, everything. And he said, you're fine to solo. So the next week I soloed, and it was the most incredible sensation, because when I got up there, I knew I was okay. I was in control of the plane and I could land safely. And it was just wonderful. I've never experienced anything like it. I was at traffic pattern altitude, which at our airport is 1,300 feet above sea level, 1,000 feet above the ground. And you could see the runway, you can see everybody taking off and landing, and they're tiny. So spotting a small plane in the air when you're at altitude is very hard, actually. Everything around you, it was just a wonderful, wonderful, peaceful experience. Having done first solo, your instructor makes you do a certain amount of solo work. And then they take you into learning navigation. This is the really the next stage of flight training. So you fly places and you learn how to put together a flight plan. You learn how to read charts. And the thing that I think shocked me most about learning to fly a small plane is how much you use little bits of paper and paper charts and notes scribbled down in a notebook, and you keep them all in your lap and you're flying the plane and you're consulting this stuff. It's not all instrumentized. I was horrified by the fact that I had to put in radio frequencies manually. The plane doesn't do it itself. I thought this was all automated. But you have to carry a knee board with pieces of information, a flight plan, all these bits of paper, and then they expect you to learn to use chart, even though what are called glass cockpit planes all have electronic displays with maps and stuff, but you actually learn using a chart, an aeronautical chart. And you have this thing open on your lap. You know, and anybody sitting in the back is like absolutely terrified by how hokey this is, but that is how you learn to navigate. You learn to deal with weather. You learn how to navigate using a compass. You learn about magnetic north. So for instance, runways are they all have magnetic designation. So runway, if it's runway 20, that's it's 200 degrees magnetic. So there's a difference there between magnetic and non-magnetic headings. Weather is really critical. You have to know how to get a weather report. You have to have a plan B. That's very important in case something happens that is unexpected. You have to do what's called aeronautical decision making, which is you making the right decision. There's a saying in aviation: there are old pilots and there are bold pilots, but there are no old, bold pilots. So you learn to be very cautious and make the right decision. And if you have to turn around and scuttle a flight, that's what you do. For me, navigation was difficult because I've never been very good at math, but you have to just do it. It's not actually that difficult. You learn to use something called the E6B flight computer, which is basically a slide rule. So that kind of took me back to A-level maths when I actually did use a slide rule. It allows you to calculate true course from wind direction on one side, and then it's got lots of other data on the other side. So nobody really uses it to fly anymore, but you have to learn to use it. When your CFI thinks you're ready, you then go in for what's called the written test, which is a multiple choice test that you have to get 70% on to pass. And then you have the check ride. The check ride is where you go up with a designated pilot examiner in the plane, and they put you through a whole series of requests to make sure that your flying skills are adequate. I found I was actually terrified of mine, but it turned out my DPE, my examiner, was a wonderful, charming woman. And she made it fun. And I never expected that to happen, you know. So I had to go out to Brackett Airport, take the plane out the night before, park it there, come home, go out in the morning, meet the DPE, and then we got in the plane and she made me do my check ride exercises. So they put you through pretty much everything you learned. But they, in addition to just flying the plane, you have to do a certain number of maneuvers, steep turns, stall practice, and then for me, the most difficult part, unusual attitudes. You do what's called hood flying. So at a certain, you have to do some flying under a hood. You put on a hood, the hood blocks the view out of the plane. You can only fly on instruments. It's a prologue to instrument training. And then, you know, you have to be able to manage the plane under the hood. But for the check ride, they put you into an unusual attitude. So she put me into a very steep bank and the nose down, and then said, get out of it. So I have to then get the plane out of that with the hood on. So that, you know, I had to sort of learn it by heart, because if you can't get the plane out of an attitude like that, you will go into a spin and you'll hit the ground. So it's potentially very dangerous, and it's very easy to get into if you don't know what you're doing. So we flew back to Brackett, I landed, and she said to me, you're a private pilot now. Then we went through a certain amount of bureaucracy with the FAA, and I was issued a temporary license. So that's basically an overview of what flight training for a small plane license is like in the United States. I'm sure it's very similar in the UK. The cost is what people often ask me about. It's not super cheap, but it's not super expensive either. I think a lot of people spend more money at the mall every weekend just buying junk. When I was in flight training, I was spending about $350 a month on it. But that's $350 I don't spend on other stuff. So I budgeted for it because I wanted to do it. And what you'll find is that most people who fly small planes, they're very passionate about it, and they budget to do it because it's something they care deeply about. They're not super wealthy. This is where I think the news media focus wholly on the far end of the bell curve, you know, the 1% of people who own large private jets, and they give this impression that people who fly planes fly private jets. Well, they actually don't. Mostly they fly small single-engine propeller-powered aircraft. That's the 98% of people who fly here. So there are ways in which you can get help for the cost. I got an AOPA flight training scholarship in 2017. I'm an AOPA member. This is the association, I never remember what the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association. It's a well-known general aviation organization in the US, and like many others, they offer scholarship support. They usually have an annual RFP, and I decided to apply for one, and much to my amazement, I actually got it. And it worked out to be about 10% of the total cost. It allowed me to buy a top-notch headset, an iPad, and a few other things I needed for the navigation part of my training. And that made a huge difference. So there are ways you can offset some of the costs of learning to fly. But as I said, it's not, you don't have to be a millionaire to do this. So people ask me, what did you learn? You know, what did you learn from this incredible investment of time and energy? I mean, it took me longer than my PhD to get the pilot's license because I'm old and I'm slow. For me, flying a plane is above all a test of character. I think to fly safely, you have to be your best self. It demands a great deal of you as a person because of the need to make good aeronautical decisions, ADM. It's a complex skill set. It's not something that most people can't learn, but it does require total focus. You learn that excellence is a habit. Excellence in any area is achievable because by repeating an action many times, you become better at it. I did an incredible amount of landing practice. I've probably done 600 landings by now. So even though, I get a little rusty, I haven't been doing much flying this year because of the weather, but I know how to land a plane. I don't know that will ever go away. I've also learned not to panic when something unexpected happens, because something unexpected will always happen when you're flying a plane. You learn to deal with it. A large part of flight training consists of learning to deal with simulated emergencies. So we are trained to deal with simulated engine outs. You're flying around the runway, and then suddenly your instructor pulls the power back and says, land the plane. So you have to learn to land with no power. You do that over and over and over and over again until it becomes second nature. But what you learn is not to panic. You learn to be adaptable and flexible, dealing with changing circumstances. The air around you is always changing. You learn to think quickly and make a decision, because making a decision is essential. It may not be the right decision, but you have to decide. So for one time, the example I always quote, I was flying with my instructor. At a certain point, since I had already done my first solo, he said, well, would you like to solo for the rest of the time you have the plane? I said, sure. And so he got out of the plane and he went away. And then what I did was, I had the plane, I had to decide what I wanted to do with it. So I was going to do pattern practice. Pattern practice is you take off, you fly around the runway, and then you land. Doesn't sound very interesting, but in fact, it tests every aspect of flight except navigation. So it tests takeoff, flying in a straight line, communicating with the air traffic control, and bringing the plane in landing, taxiing, everything. So when we had been taxiing, we'd seen a coyote. There are almost never coyotes at Del Monte Airport. I've never seen a coyote there before. And it was sitting a fair way away, but you could see it sort of sitting by the side of the taxiway. I go to the hold short point and I'm clear to take off. I am now accelerating down the runway, but I'm not at takeoff speed. Suddenly, the coyote crosses the runway in front of me. It was probably the size of an Alsatian, and it looked at me. It turned around, it looked at me, and it said, "This is my runway." So I'm thinking, what am I going to do? I can't. If I keep going, I'll hit the coyote, which will probably take out the plane. But I'm not at takeoff speed. So I thought, well, I'll try taking off. And in fact, I took off. So I took off over the coyote. And the reason I took off is I wasn't accompanied by my instructor. So there was actually less weight in the plane. It was just me. So the plane actually took off. And I took off over the coyote. I fly around the runway. There are 3 guys ahead of me, and they're going, wow, you took off over the coyote? Yeah, and? So then I called Tower, and I did something all pilots dream of. I said to Tower, Monte Tower, I'd like to report a runway incursion by the coyote. And they all started laughing in the tower. Then a guy comes in on the 45-degree towards the runway, which means he's coming from a different airport. And he says, I hear you have a coyote on the runway. So news travels really fast. They're all laughing away. I'm thinking, you did not know how scary that was. But the point is to make a decision. And when I talked to my instructor about it, he said, you made a decision and you didn't break the plane and you didn't break any regulations. This happens a lot. During my navigation training, I got lost a couple of times because I missed a landmark, didn't know where I was. Typically, you can call approach control and they'll give you a vector and nobody laughs at you. They're there to help you. It's always better to ask air traffic control for help than try and muscle your way through an uncertainty, because they're there to prevent in-air collisions. That's their only job. And they will, if you're lost, they will help you navigate. So they gave me a vector and I came home. So the other thing that I thought, for me, as a person of color who flies a plane, and this doesn't necessarily apply to anybody else, but the aviation world is held together, the world of people in planes flying, by tail numbers, radio frequencies, and transponder codes. It's all voices. So the color of your skin doesn't really matter when you're in the air. because it's all radio frequencies and voices. And that was really, really nice. You know, I knew that people's first reaction to me was whether I was doing something stupid with the plane, not the color of my skin. And the pilot community I found has been very, very welcoming and helpful. So for me, that was an important perception that I had about flying a plane. So needless to say, this has had a large effect on my career. I did not expect it to do so because I started flying primarily as a hobby. For me, you know, I always like to learn new things, and I move on when I've learned something. So I had come to a point in my fundraising career where, with my particular skill set, you know, I had pretty much done everything. And so flying came along, and it had a lot of unexpected effects. I think one of the reasons I got the AOPA flight scholarship is because I know how to write a grant proposal. So my grant writing experience really helped there. When I saw the RFP, and I think of it as an RFP, a request for proposals rather than an award program, I thought, well, you know, I can do this. I was surprised I got it, but because it was very different from a research grant, but it really did help having that information. And I provide mentoring in that area to other applicants who are interested in applying for flight scholarships. The most important thing that came out of this is through a contact of mine who has a Facebook page. He is a certified flight instructor and runs a Facebook page called Greg Brown's Student Pilot page. I got involved with the General Aviation Awards program. He won Flight Instructor of the Year, I think in 2009, and I'd been sort of following his Facebook page when he asked me if I was interested in serving on that board. I was like totally gobsmacked because I wasn't even licensed at that point. And the General Aviation Awards is the United States' oldest award program for general aviation. And I should have defined this earlier. General aviation is all aviation except commercial and military. So it's everything else. So I said, well, you know, I'm not even licensed. Everybody on this board is very, very well known in this area. So one of the women on the board, her name's Arlene McMahon, she wrote one of the chapters in the textbook that I use for my written test. It's like, I can't do this. He said, well, they have lots of pilots on the board. They actually need somebody who can fundraise and who's a good administrator. So, you know, I contacted the board. They needed a new board secretary. So that was me for a year. It was very, very interesting because it allowed me to go to the Oshkosh Air Show, because these awards are, which we announced today, actually, the 2023 National Honorees. The awards are made at the Oshkosh Air Show in July of every year. This is in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. And it gave me a way of going to air shows, actually. I had gone to a couple before then, but I'd never gone to one quite like this. So I met the board at the Oshkosh Air Show in 2018, and they asked me if I wanted to be chairman of the board. So I said yes, like a fool. But, you know, it's given me some amazing contacts, amazing experience. I have to deal with the FAA. I've met everybody in the pilot community. I've met an enormous number of very, very interesting people in general aviation. I've had a lot of fun managing this board. I'm at a stage in my career where it's nice to have board responsibilities. This was the first time I was ever asked to do this. It's volunteer work, it's not paid, but it still affected my career. I mean, I could do some aviation related job probably as a result of this. One of the things that I've gotten out of my training that's a lot of fun is going to air shows, actually. I've been to Farnborough, and I've taken my sister and my niece to the Paris Air Show, which is incredible. There's also the Berlin Air Show, which I have not been to. But I've gone to a couple of little air shows here, and I have to go to Oshkosh every year, obviously, for the General Aviation Awards. And so you see a completely different world, you know. It's a very accessible world, which if you just read the news, is not necessarily true. I have consulting clients in aviation and aerospace. Mandala Space Ventures, which is Pasadena's first accelerator for the emerging space economy. I fly regularly with a friend who has a sustainable aviation company, Hydroplane. I know a lot of pilots, and actually, for me, one thing that was very important, understanding aviation, it helps me tolerate commercial air travel much better. I'd gotten to the point where after years and years and years of commercial flying, I was just getting very stressed out. But I don't get as stressed out anymore because I understand what the pilots have to do. When you sit in a plane and you think the plane is just taxiing, the pilots are actually doing all that stuff I talked about. They're doing their pre-flights, they're checking their instruments, they're talking to tower. They're doing a lot of stuff on that taxi to make sure that your flight is safe. So with that kind of insight, you know, I don't get as impatient. If there's a weather-related cancellation, I don't worry about that. You know, you do not want to fly in bad weather. So many accidents happen from bad weather situations. It kills a lot of pilots. So don't do it. I think for me, flying a plane is the best workout I know for body, mind, and spirit, because it forces you to focus totally on what my flight instructor refers to as flying the plane. When you're in the air, you aviate, navigate, communicate in that order. The first order of business is to keep the plane safe in the air. It requires total focus. What I find is that it gives me a break from the daily grind. Even though it appears very intense, when I get out of the plane, I find that I got away from it all for an hour, and it's just very, very relaxing that way. It can't be exhausted as a hobby. You can always be a better pilot, and you can always acquire another rating. It has history, books, movies, air shows, air races, everything. It's opened a lot of doors for me, particularly in sustainable aviation, through the contacts I've made. It allows me to mentor young women pilots of all colors. It's given me a certain amount of nice publicity relatively late in life, which I do appreciate. And it's good knowing that you can fly into your 80s if your health is good. We have a lot of pilots in the club who are 80 to 90 and who are just training. So I think it's one other reason to maintain good health. And I remember thinking when I first started, all the private pilots I met, they were all fit and skinny. They were very fit and they were mentally very sharp. So I did it partly to slow down cognitive decline in middle age. And I think if you're interested in health, it's one way of staying healthy. You really do have to be very sharp. And I also like to be part of a club, Women Who Fly Planes. It's not a very big club. So that's pretty much what I had to say. And it's been transformational for me. It's not as inaccessible as you'd think. And I do recommend it to people who are interested. It's a great workout. So any questions?
Thank you so much, Sandya. I think that was really genuinely fascinating, and I'm sure everybody agrees. It's interesting that you wanted to be an astronaut previously, as you know, Leicester's very well known for its space research. So you're clearly very in tune with the spirit of Leicester as a whole, which is really nice to see. But yes, wow, what a story, and I'm sure everyone will agree that it's a really great example of how determination to do something that you were really quite passionate about and interested in prevailed. And as you've mentioned, it took a while for you to do that, but you seem quite determined to do it, and I think that's a really great story. So we've got a chance now to ask Sandya some questions. So thanks to those that have submitted questions already. Please do keep them coming, pop them in the chat box. and we'll ask those. We've got about 20 minutes or so left, so we'll try and get through as many as we possibly can. But I'll kick it off with the questions, Sandya. You've mentioned obviously there's a bit of a lack of women pilots. Why do you think that is? What's the reason for that, do you think, and what can we do about it on International Women's Day?
I think the airlines have been very slow about recruiting women. They don't really go after that demographic, and many of the flying organizations have been slow about recruiting women. So this is changing, at least in the United States. I know the year I got my AOPA scholarship, when I looked at everybody that had got one, it was very diverse. There were men, women, young people, older people, white people, people of color, everybody. It was really, really diverse. I wrote to AOPA saying, you know, but your board is all old white guys. So I never heard back on that communication. Right. So the people in the power, that they're all men, they're not changing at that level. I think change takes time. I think there's a lot of ignorance about flying. So people think I couldn't do this. So there's no way that's made for people who are not necessarily in aviation to get involved. There's no cross communication. So
there's not like a natural path to.
There's no natural path. So what I've known a lot of people who got into it because their dad had a plane and they've been flying small planes since they were 9 years old, and they know about airports and they know about how to get flight training, but most people don't. And it's still presented in the media as just rich millionaire with a private jet, but that's not flying. If you've got enough money, you can buy a big jet, hire 2 pilots to fly it and sit in the back. This is not flying. No. But that's all we ever hear about. So sure. I think, you know, and I always say, it's like when I'm up there and it's all radio frequencies and voices, the plane doesn't know what gender you are. It doesn't know, and it doesn't care. And actually what I was told, what the first lesson my flight instructor said to me, he said, women make the better pilots. They don't manhandle the plane. And they're so finely tuned. You can fly a Cessna 172 with 2 fingers. If all other external forces are constant, you can fly it with 2 fingers on the yoke. You don't have to be a big burly guy. I mean, it does take some physical strength. It's physical. It's a physical workout. You're not just sitting there pressing buttons. But you don't have to be a guy to fly a plane. And these are the sorts of insights that you only really have if you're a woman, and there aren't very many women pilots. So no one is communicating. I think it has complex sources. But yeah. I think in the end, the airlines and the aviation community need to welcome women.
Sure.
And hire them.
It's interesting, isn't it, that you say that obviously you have seen that diversity exist at that level, but not perhaps at that board level that you mentioned. And do you think that is a matter of time? Do you think that will filter through, or is there anything else that could be done to kind of encourage those? Because it seems like it's less of a problem, kind of people believing that they can come in and do that. But what's the step up?
Well, I think one of the problems with getting a job as a private pilot actually is you have to start very young, and this is where people often don't have any information. So you have to have a lot of hours, which means you typically get a pilot's license very young, and then you do various lower level aviation jobs, or you teach, until you have enough hours to apply for a job. So knowing that is the path, that's not information that's very commonly available, I think. It's like, I wish I'd known X, Y, and Z, and I might not have done what I did. But I didn't when I was 16 or 17. No. So there's a gap there. I think, I saw a survey on Facebook where they had been talking about the fact that a lot of passengers on commercial jets feel worried if there's a woman in command. Wow. So even with the flying public, there's this perception, I feel safe over the male pilot. How do you contest that? People were leaving notes on table napkins saying, you know, I would feel much safer on this flight with the guy in the cockpit. This was 3 or 4 years ago. Wow. It caused a lot of, I think you can't just blame aviation. You know, there's also educating the public that it's okay for women to do this.
Sure. Yeah,
It's
so education across the board then, really.
across the board, that's for everything.
Yeah. Okay.
We have a number of women pilots in our club, which is, it's nice, you know, there are quite a lot of women pilots.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. So we've got, we'll move on to another question from Anna. What would your dream flight be?
My dream flight? I think, I wish I had, I don't yet have the flying expertise to do something no Indian woman has done that I know of, which is, you know, well, I think there has been one, you know, some sort of round the world flight. I wish, no, actually, no, you know, I would like to participate in an air race. These were very famous in the 20s and 30s. They were one way in which technology developed. They had air races to promote advances in aviation. Then they kind of died out for a while, but they have come back.
Okay.
So one of the women in our flying club actually participated in one of our local air races. So she asked me if I wanted to fly with her, and I was out of the country, so I couldn't go. So I would have loved to have just done this in California air race, which at my level of expertise was actually doable. We could have co-piloted. She got somebody else to go with her. And I really, really regret that I wasn't able to do that. So my dream, this is my dream at this point. I'd like to do an air race. You know, there was
Sounds scary.
When the Disney movie Planes came out, a bunch of us went to see it, all pilots, and we were going to shred this movie to pieces. We couldn't believe it. They got all the aviation right.
Wow. That is great.
We just sat there, and it's about an air race. And I thought, oh, those were the glory days of flying.
Wow.
So that's what I would like to do, participate in an air race.
What would be the one piece of advice that you would give to somebody who either fancies learning to fly or actually has any sort of dream or ambition that they want to pursue, particularly if they're at a later stage of life? What advice would you give to those people?
Well, the general advice I always give is some things only come your way once in a lifetime. And I always say, do it. You don't have to do anything stupid, but check it out. You can always go to a small airport. You know, when I'm in England, I fly out of Booker Aviation in High Wycombe. And you can always call a small flight school like that and say, can I just go up for a 1 hour fun flight? Just try it. Mm-hmm. They will take you up for an hour. You'll get a feeling as to whether this is something you even want to do, you know. But some things only come your way once in a lifetime. And I think you know when those things are. And so just do it, is my advice. You know,
yeah,
reason fashion. You look into it, do the research. You can usually do a small version of the big thing.
Sure.
And then make a decision. But don't just walk away from it saying, I can't do this. Because, you know, when I was in my 20s and I first moved to California, I was living in Orange County. Orange County Airport at that time was full of small aircraft. And I thought, oh, I wish I could do that, but you probably have to be wealthy. Well, I could have done it for a fraction of what it actually cost me. Sure. Gas at that time was 99 cents a gallon.
Indeed. Yeah.
They're always going up. So, you know, do it sooner rather than later.
Well, I think that's good advice then, isn't it? And it could be applied to anything, as I say, any dream or ambition you've got. So sort of start small, just try it and do it sooner rather than later.
Yeah, right. Some things don't, if you ignore them, they don't come back.
Sure. No. So we've got another question from Jeff Johnston, who says, having flown with you, Sandya, perhaps he's curious about the challenges of flying into a small airport amidst the vast concrete jungle of a large city where the runway is only another patch of pavement. So I guess Jeff is asking how you sort of approach that.
Well, you have to do a lot of research if you're going to go to a strange airport. So I do what's called, if it's somewhere I haven't been before, I do flight planning, usually the week beforehand. I have a printout of the airport runway layout, the taxiways, all of this is available on the internet. I've looked at it on the chart. I have programmed it into my iPad, which has a program called ForeFlight, which allows you to just track where you are, the magenta line. I try to find out everything I possibly can about that airport well ahead of time, so I don't make a mistake or break a regulation, which is really what you worry about. You can land a plane safely, but you don't know if you've broken some kind of FAA reg, and then Tower calls you and gives you a phone number, and then, you know, so you can't do too much preparation. Checking the weather, everything. It's a lot of work. And commercial pilots have to do that. The difference between me and a commercial pilot is the commercial pilot is flying the same route back and forth. So they know it inside out. But I'm not under that compulsion. I can fly here one day, somewhere else the next, but the onus is on me to do my research.
Sure.
So that I don't fly into something I didn't expect.
Yeah. More good advice in general, I think. Preparation is key.
Learning to fly in Los Angeles is a challenge because it's got very complex airspace. So you have to think in 3 dimensions also. And so I'm always terrified I'm going to fly into somebody else's airspace. And this is where, you know, it's not just a compass thing, it's also a height thing. You know, they will say stay below 2,500 feet when you're going somewhere because you're underneath somebody's airspace. You have to call, you can go into their airspace, but you have to call tower and get permission. So you've got all those complexities. So there's no substitute for research. I knew Jeff would ask me that question.
Thank you very much for that, Jeff. So there's an interesting question actually coming from Tess. She says that you mentioned that with some planes you can fly them using just 2 fingers. And she's asking the question, does that mean that people with disabilities could actually fly these kinds of planes? And, and obviously we've talked about diversity, Sandya, and that's one area that we haven't explored. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, there's it depends on the disability. So what the FAA doesn't like are mental illness issues, cardiovascular issues. You know, if you're going to have a stroke and you have to have decent vision, but you can fly with glasses. You have to have a medical periodically. So, but the medical restrictions are much, much tighter for commercial pilots than they are for people like me. I fly under something called basic med. So my doctor can sign me off. I mean, I'm just going to fly somewhere and have lunch. I'm not doing anything high risk. But for people with disabilities, there is hope. There's a well-known filmmaker who made a movie recently about a young woman who was born without arms, and she learned to fly a plane with her feet. Wow. And she qualified as a pilot. Wow. And it was just unbelievably inspirational. Nick Spark is his name, and he also made a wonderful film about Pancho Barnes, who was a famous aviatrix in Pasadena in the 1920s. But his most recent film is about this young woman who was born, I think she was a thalidomide baby, though I'm not 100% sure. But she learned to fly a plane, to pilot it with her feet, because she doesn't have arms.
Fantastic, really inspirational story. Brilliant.
Yeah, so
thank you for sharing that with us.
It's, I could not have done it. I mean, it was just unbelievable. But she's a good, safe pilot.
Brilliant.
I'd fly her.
Yeah, thank you for that. We've got a question from Sally. Have you ever flown a glider?
Have I ever flown where?
A glider. So
no, I actually prefer the idea of flying with power.
Yes.
Because I've got more control.
Understandably, I think.
Right. I have not gotten around to flying a glider. We have glider pilots where I fly, and there are also helicopters and, you know, experimental aircraft. So I have not flown a glider. I honestly would feel safer with an engine, because with a glider you really are dependent on air currents. So you have to kind of know where they are and utilize that resource.
Yeah, it's an extra kind of element, I guess, or a different approach.
Right.
Manjula has said that you're a very inspirational woman, which I agree with wholeheartedly. What's your message to parents of faith communities about how to encourage their daughters to be pilots?
Well, I think if you'd encourage your son to be a pilot, the same reasons apply. You know, the plane doesn't know. What does it care? who's flying. It's a skill set like anything else. And it's something that never gets old. So I don't know, since, yeah, if your son can fly a plane, I think your daughter can fly a plane. And, you know, anyone should be able to do it.
Okay.
And in terms of any faith, for me, it was, you know, I love being up in the air. To me, it's almost a religious thing. You know, I would hate for anyone to have to miss that experience. It's just wonderful to be up there.
Yeah, thank you. And finally, then, we chatted a little bit before we came online about the sort of sustainability question around aviation, and I just wondered, you chatted obviously about certain research that's happening into how to improve that, and I just wondered if you could share perhaps just a few little bits and pieces with us so that we understand a little bit more about what that situation is before we wrap up this evening.
Well, there's sustainable aviation is a major activity right now in the US and globally. What I have found very, very interesting is I've gotten to know a lot of the people who are in it. So we're seeing research in the United States on electric aviation, hydrogen-powered aviation, hybrids, everything. It's a huge effort. Yes, I fly a small plane that uses leaded fuel. Actually, even at that level, the FAA has begun the process of authorizing unleaded fuel for small planes. You know, there was an issue. They just fly better with leaded fuel. So if you want an alternative, it's got to be something that works and doesn't compromise safety, because you don't want people crashing. But we're at that point there. And then there's a huge amount of research going on replacing petrol-driven engines completely, certainly in the small plane use case. My current the person I fly with regularly, Anita Sengupta, she is also an Indian woman pilot, and she is CEO of her own sustainable aviation company, Hydroplane, and she's building a hydrogen-powered power plant that you can just pop into a plane. Wow. And it's good for a number of other transportation applications. So I hear from her the latest on what's going on with sustainable aviation. So I think it's accelerating. It's moving very fast. There's a lot of funding for it. There are a lot of VCs that are interested, a lot of companies launching. So I think we're going to see a lot of change. Now, when it hits commercial, that will be a bit longer. But in the general aviation arena, so last year, Hydroplane had a booth at the Oshkosh Air Show. There was a huge amount of interest from the average Joe who flies a small plane. You know, they were inundated with people who were checking the technology and very, very interested in knowing that where this is in the implementation timeline, how long is it going to take, is it practical, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. So certainly going in the right direction then, and lots happening that we perhaps don't hear about.
Yeah, and it's not covered very well in the media.
No, sure.
You know, I think, you know, I read The Guardian, and I think their aviation coverage is it's, you know, fairly early stage, not that great. They tend to cover all the millionaires with private jets.
Sure.
You know.
No, it's really interesting to hear a different take on that, and you know, this evening's been fantastic, and I hope that everybody who's been able to join us has enjoyed it as much as I have. I found it really interesting, and chatting to you has been great, Sandya. So thank you once again for giving up your evening to be with us and to chat to us. And thank all of our guests for joining us, and particularly those that submitted questions. As I say, I hope you've enjoyed the evening. Please do complete the post-event evaluation form. The link will be popped in the chat, and that will be shared with you shortly. Upcoming Festival of Change events can be found on our website, so do check that out too. But filling in that form will help us improve events in the future. So thank you in advance for doing that for us. And once again, a huge thank you to Sandya, and a very happy International Women's Day to you all.
Thank you.
It's been a great event, and thank you all for being with us this evening.
Thank you for inviting me. This was, as I said, a great honor, and wow.
Yes, and we didn't get to talk too much about University Challenge, which I wanted to. So we'll perhaps have to get you back, Sandya, to do another event about that experience in the future.
My 3 years at Leicester were just wonderful. I was very, very happy there.
Well, that's really great for us to hear. So so thank you, and do all continue to keep in touch. And Sandya, I'm sure we'll see you again very soon. Thank you.
So. Take care.
Take care. Thank you all. Bye bye.